I'm curious if you foresee a future where websites are designed in a different way for AI interaction. Does this have an implication for front-end developers? Does AI learn to act like human? Where do you think the world goes there?
I've been a big believer that the most successful AI products have been the ones that interface with the world as it is, as opposed to the world that doesn't exist. And the best example is Waymo, where Waymo has worked so well for me because it didn't require that the roads and street lights and other cars change in any way. It just adapted to that world. And I think something similar is going to happen with agents, where if we need to create a bunch of new websites for agents, we're probably going to see dramatically less adoption than the agent that actually just figures out the same interface that a human would. I actually think we're going to have agent feedback being given back to developers. When you start getting that feedback, you might decide to invest in a pathway that is better for the agent.
Guillermo, first, I'm so excited to have you on. Thank you for joining.
Thanks for having me.
To kick things off, to really understand Vercel as it is today, which we'll definitely get into, we need to understand you, of course. You've been a coder and an entrepreneur for most of your life. So explain to me, how does an 11-year-old in the suburbs outside of Buenos Aires start his first business? That's a pretty unusual story.
Yeah, it's unusual in that I started programming when I was really, really, really young. And I lived in an area of Argentina where even having a computer was pretty rare, quite frankly. But my parents were super interested in everything related to science and engineering. They were engineers themselves, industrial and chemical engineers. And my dad in particular just bought a computer early on, brought it home. And he always had this idea about like, what more can we do with it? What can we hack? I don't think he had the language hack, but like we had that tinkering mindset. And when I was about 10, 11 years old, I started with my brother creating anime websites. Like I had like a Dragon Ball Z website and whatnot. And that led to this like start creating websites on the internet thing. And by the time I was 11, an opportunity came up to join a referral program for the growing eBay of Argentina at the time. Mercado Libre, which is now a US listed public traded company. And I created a website that kind of went viral and was successful in bringing referrals to that system. And I think my first check from my own website was when I was basically 11, 12 years old, which is pretty shocking.
That's amazing. Do you remember that moment? Like what happens to your brain chemistry when you're 11, you get money for something that you've built?
I have a lot of funny anecdotes. Like, for example, I was very active in the forums of the community of website owners that were like sort of part of this referral program. And I honestly couldn't believe that I was making so much money. So I was like creating all these threads about like, is this even chat? Is this real? Like, guys, is this going to work? Like, I was kind of like,
am I being scammed?
Yeah, I was myself kind of turning on the program a little bit because I was so shocked and I was so young. And I remember one time we got a phone call and imagine being so young and getting a phone call. And so like my stomach dropped and it was the manager of this program. And he was like, just wanted to touch base because you've asked all these questions. I just wanted to like confirm to you, like, this is 100% real. It's working really well. You're doing a great job. And that's just a moment that I was so young that I don't even have that many memories like outside of this, like from just like hanging out in my house and whatever. And another moment was when my mom got the check and we cashed it and was like, just like looking at it and like then seeing it converted into currency. Like, it's funny because I've always been into creating things. And for me being in Argentina, which is a country that economically has always had tremendous challenges, it kind of opened the whole opportunity for me to like actually help my family. Not at the time because that was ended up being like a one-off. But later on, it was both the appetite to like learn about open source and web technologies and whatnot, but also being able to financially contribute to my family's earnings was kind of mind-blowing.
Were they fully supportive of that? I know that, you focused more on this versus traditional education. So I don't know if that was a contentious topic in the household or if, the 11-year-old businessman made the case for you.
Yeah, that's right. It was contentious for everybody. In fact, now that I'm speaking of it, like one of the reasons that I probably didn't continue with that program and other things is when I was about 12 years old, I had to start preparing for the entry exam of a highly prestigious public high school in Argentina, where I had to study a lot. It was basically like, I guess the equivalent here would be the SAT. And so I had to study a lot. Like literally I would go to elementary school and then come home and start studying all afternoon and like into the night. And I put a lot of effort because and I still love a good competition. So the competition for that school was who gets more points for the entry exam. And I competed voraciously. And I got into the top students, and my family was very proud. It was like a whole family investment, which I've heard in the U.S. it also becomes kind of like a whole family thing to like send kids to like those preparatory schools for the exam and whatnot. And what happened is it started this conflict of like I'm building a career as a software engineer with clients. I remember when I was about that age, I had a client in the Netherlands who would send me really innovative projects. We had built one of the first like calorie counter interfaces for the European market using all kinds of like advanced technology at the time. Like we had to use a lot of client-side JavaScript because you could add, oh, today I ate a burger. Like how many more calories does that add and whatnot? So I built that whole like front-end interface for that project. And then we had a makeup e-commerce, and then we had all these awesome projects together. And it was my buddy in the Netherlands who was a young adult basically, and the teenager in Argentina just implementing. And so I had this like
Did everyone on the other side know that they were talking to a kid?
in the beginning, never, because they would find me through this awesome profile that I built on a freelancing website with all my reviews, 5-star, 5-star, 5 stars. Like I had a weird nickname. I don't know. I think at the time on the internet, it wasn't so common to like have a real name policy. So like it was all like funky usernames and whatnot. At the beginning, they didn't know. And obviously later on, as we built more of a close relationship, they would find out, or I would have to be like, oh, sorry, I'm going to school now. So talk to you later. And I was also actually, with that project, for example, or with that client, I started making material contributions to my family. But at one point, I had to draw a line. I'm going to go all in on this exam, or I'm going to continue working a ton online. And so it was always kind of a contentious topic. Once I got into school, I always tell the story of like I went from being like the best student to the worst student very quickly because more and more and more of my time was just consumed by contributions that I was making to open source, and I was building quite the important profile online. It was more than just having like an ad hoc client. I was supporting open source projects, and that just became kind of like the calling of my life.
Well, you had your calling and you found it very early. You mastered the competition, so you got that. The part that you cared about more so than
I did get that, yeah.
more so than the school. If we fast forward, you eventually moved from Argentina to San Francisco, where we see you today when you were 18. But let's actually fast forward all the way to 2015. At that point, perhaps unsurprising based on this background, you'd already started 2 companies, Learn
Yep.
Boost and CloudUp. You authored several popular open source projects, Socket.io, Mongoose. So where did the idea for Vercel come from, and how did you know that this was the next big thing that you wanted to pursue and go all in on?
Yeah, so the very first idea I had, so for context, those 2 companies, I exited to a company called Automatic, the parent company of WordPress. And then when I left, I knew that I wanted to do something in the front end and JavaScript ecosystem. In fact, the reason that WordPress was interested in acquiring my company was they were making this transition from sort of like PHP monolith architecture to an architecture that was predicated on PHP could act as a backend, but you need to bring a lot of interactivity and finesse and engineering to the front end because the app of the moment at the time, for example, one huge inspiration was Google Docs. You can do all this advanced multiplayer collaboration on the client. We started bringing more and more power to the web browser. And so it was almost like there was a shift in the industry away from just like stuff in the database world or the backend language like Java to really awesome experiences running on the client. And so after I left, I was like, okay, I know that I need to do something in this space. And at the time, two very important projects had just been open sourced. One was React by Meta, which was a UI library. And then another one was Kubernetes by Google, which was an orchestrator for cloud native workloads. And so this is literally the best of times, right? Like we have two projects that, of course, if you saw them early, you could build a career on it, right? Like because they were going to become so dominant in the industry. And kudos to Meta and Google also for open sourcing these awesome pieces of technology. And so I sat down, and the first thing you do when you create a startup, especially if you're kind of like design minded like me, you want to create a pretty awesome website landing page saying like we're in business, reach out to us, this is our mission, this is what we're setting out to do, we're recruiting, things like that. And when I sat down to create that website, I literally couldn't. On the React side, it was so much configuration. You had to assemble all the pieces of your tool. It's almost like if I told you, look, you're going to need a power drill to get this job done. But first, assemble your own battery pack and assemble your own circuitry and provision some plastic from China and then just mesh it all together. And then you can start building. That was kind of the story. And it happened both simultaneously on the React side and it happened with the infrastructure. So once I did have the project set up, okay, I'm going to deploy it. And then, okay, check back with me 2 weeks later because creating all the cutting edge cloud infrastructure would take so much effort. And so maybe a little bit unbeknownst to me at the time, I was on this path to create Vercel because those early experiences of building that little framework to scratch my own itch became Next.js. Fast forward to today, Next.js has 1.2 million monthly active developers and 7 million weekly downloads. So it's a lot of other people felt that pain of how do I orchestrate my front end, right? And then on the Vercel side, 110 billion weekly requests that we served because we automated the process of creating infrastructure by looking at the framework. So when you deploy your Next.js application to Vercel, we automate what otherwise would have taken me months, weeks. And by the way, as I said, by the time I was a pretty experienced engineer, I had been doing front end before most people have been doing front end, right? Since I was.
You had your website when you were in high school that was getting, yeah.
That's right. That's right. So if it was difficult, I guess that was kind of like, if I had to summarize, the inspiration for
It's hard
Vercel
for
was,
me. It must be hard for
that's
everyone
right.
else.
I'm terminally online. This is all I do. I'm obsessed. And yet it's a lot of friction and pain.
Was there, before you reached this massive scale, both for Next.js and for Vercel, I think, tell me if I have the timing right, you launched Next.js about a year after you launched Vercel, granted different name. But was there a moment in time for each of them where you were like, hey, I'm seeing early innings or feeling product market fit for both Next.js and for Vercel?
So Next.js was that internal tool that we had because we had to build UI. We knew that there were other solutions for deploying to the cloud. I mean, you could use a raw cloud directly like AWS, right? But we knew we had this intuition that we could build a lot of differentiation on just the ease of use. And we think of it as almost like the bridge to the cloud. And we knew that the user interface to our console, our dashboards, the sign-up experience, the funnel to deploying your first app, which is so important for PLG. We knew that all that had to be very fast, very streamlined, very pretty. And so we built Next.js almost as an internal tool. Like it was just, this is how we build UI internally at Vercel. And so one of the critical moments was realizing that as time passed, it was working really well for us. And we would onboard a new hire or a contractor, and it was easy, and we just love it. Like just using it was pleasurable. And I remember actually one critical moment was the Meta team was getting a lot of feedback of like, look, you've given the world this amazing engine. Thank you very much. But it is hard to get started. There were a lot of memes on the internet. In fact, like the web development community is always like sort of like communicating with memes. And one meme was, I actually remember it almost perfectly. Someone had said, Johnny is getting ready to start his React app. And it was that meme of the guys in front of a gigantic blackboard full of equations and math and advanced science. And like Johnny was just trying to start that React app. And everybody was laughing and dunking, like the classic thing that social media unfortunately can sometimes do. And I was like, wait a second, we've solved that problem. We didn't even have to, it's not we were fishing for a problem. We're like, yeah, that's why we built this tool internally. And so that was like a huge moment for me because I was like, okay, I'll just turn that into my slide deck presentation for why Next.js. So I would go to conferences and I was like, okay, this is the tweet. Like 1 million views. They didn't say views, like 1 million likes, gazillion retweets, whatever. And I guess it's that famous idiom of like, you have to be ready, right? Like you have to have put in the work, and then you have those opportunities to launch where it makes perfect sense, the perfect timing. Obviously, it's when it's met with that amazing preparation that we had at the time. But that was for me like a very, very memorable moment.
Yeah. I mean, I think that building tools that you actually need internally, you're not the only ones. And so it's a very natural way. If you're a representative of a lot of the world, it's a very natural way to get that product market fit. And so, we're here obviously to talk about AI, but this is very helpful framing. When did AI become a core part of Vercel's product strategy?
So one of the things that Next.js, I almost remember vividly writing the README. So which is funny. If you go back, hopefully it's still there. If you go back to the very first commit, we did what I would call README driven development. So software projects always traditionally have a README file because it comes from the old days of like Unix, of like you get something delivered to your computer, you unpack it, and then you look at the folder and you're like, where do I start? Go to the README, right? This is even before websites were like so prominent for documentation and marketing, etc. And so what I did with Next.js was we had this awesome internal tool. But it wasn't quite perfect. I mean, as you could imagine, a product designed for broad consumption versus a product that is like a little bit specialized to the problems that you're having day to day is not going to be one-to-one. We just open source it. So what I did is I created a README that said, described what the framework did and how you would create your first page. And this is a technique that had served me really, really well with another popular open source project I released called Socket.io, where one of the ways that I challenge myself is in the first 2 paragraphs and first code snippet, can you get the main ideas across? So that's kind of what I did with the Next.js README. And then it's almost like a primitive AI, right? Like I gave the team that specification, especially my co-founder, Naoyuki Kanezawa, and out came the framework, which was a lot of retrofitting of the internal tool, which my other co-founder, Toni Kovanen, had been working on. So we kind of merged the new ideas in a specification with whatever we had internally, and out came the framework. One of the critical things that I embedded in that README was it has to have a great developer experience. When you save a file, it has to immediately fast refresh. So it has to, as soon as you save, you see what you're creating in real time. In fact, one of the inspirations for Vercel was what we called real-time global deployments. I've always been obsessed with this idea of real-time. Real-time. Like everything is to be pushed to you as soon as possible. And this is what I would call DX 1.0 now. Like a lot of people in the DevTools world talk about DX or developer experience. Developer experience 1.0 has pretty simple axiomatic rules. For example, if a developer after saving is waiting for minutes, then that's not a good developer experience. Developers have a tolerance, especially developers like me, which get super distracted easily. You need to keep them in the zone. Like if the tool is not responsive, that's not a good developer experience. And I would apply this axiom pretty rigorously to everything I do. So on the deployment side, one of the things we did was make deployment as easy as running one command or running git push. But within a second, you have to have a URL that you can access and share.
So how do you do that? Like, what's the big challenge in getting that to be done quickly? I know you can't explain it in a sentence, but
This is actually one of my favorite nerd topics because I've analyzed that pipeline and I've traced every step so obsessively that I could tell you like everything that goes into it with pretty staggering detail. But I'll tell you one of the tricks was actually inspired by when I first arrived to Silicon Valley and I had the fortune and kind of like serendipity of being in the same co-working space where Instagram was getting started. One of the things that Instagram did was whenever you would share a photo, as you would select it, they would put you into this like super streamlined wizard to publish your photo. And one of the things that they would ask is, what filter do you want to apply? Which is why so many people got into Instagram. It was the filters in the beginning. In the background, they were uploading the photo. So by the time you'd selected your filter and give it your title and description, whatever, you're like, what? It's live? And like, how is this thing so fast? So performance is not just about the latency characteristics of a certain discrete process, but it's also the progressive experience that you give to the customer. And so when you deploy to Vercel, we immediately allocate a URL while the build process of the application is happening in the background. So you can copy and paste that URL and send it over to someone and say, hey, like, please give me feedback on this. And so by the time they get that URL, maybe the deployment is already ready. And of course, you also have to legitimately make the deployment very fast. So a ton of engineering has gone into build process, virtualization, pre-warming, packaging, compression, global API distribution, like early TLS termination, like all the things that actually make the physics of the process from first principle as compressed as possible.
But I love your point, which is, okay, even if you compress it, even if you make this as fast as possible, there's the developer experience side, or in the case of Instagram, the user experience side, where you're kind of doing something else. You're keeping them busy for a moment. So
Yeah,
that you can just
it's like an art and a science.
It's an art and a science. Yeah, I love that.
And so that's what using the Andrej Karpathy Software 1.0 versus the AI world of Software 2.0, my framework is developer experience 1.0 was all of that. And of course, it's going to be relevant forever. Like, no one will want a slow deployment infrastructure.
That's like the Jeff Bezos, everyone wants faster.
Yeah, it's like a faster horse. It's like we have the horse and we want it. No one will say, I don't want a faster horse. But the car would be, what if AI can now be the one that writes my app or optimizes my app or gives me performance recommendations or even suggests a patch before I've even sat down and opened my code editor to trigger all those little like developer experience processes that I was talking about. So for me, I realized that AI was going to create new opportunities to give developer experiences that kind of like disrupted that workflow. The workflow is not going to be the same.
It's almost obvious in retrospect, but I'm just curious when it became obvious for you.
Yeah, there's a couple things. So number one is we have two main AI products. One is B0, which is our web engineering agent. So it's very much English to front end, English to expert React answers, the ChatGPT for web development. The other one is the AI SDK. The AI SDK is more like a low-level tool. It's actually more like Next.js. It's like a framework for creating AI applications. So on the framework side, it was pretty obvious because developers were so excited to build AI applications as the LLMs started coming out that we knew from just talking to customers that we needed to provide them with infrastructure and tools to be more productive and even to make some of these applications possible. Just to give you an example, you're going to notice that when you go to ChatGPT, you send them a request and then it starts responding it can take some time to respond. And going back to the Instagram metaphor, you have to find a system that can stream the result from the server. And in some cases, do transformations of that pipeline and stream it on the go. And so that was a non-trivial set of improvements that we had to make to the infrastructure both on the compute side and also some of the libraries that make it easy to express these transformations, which, by the way, are for developers, this has always been a pretty difficult cognitively area of dealing with asynchrony, dealing with failure that could happen in the middle of the pipeline, dealing with like getting the right chunk sizes out of the stream and so on and so forth. So you can think of the AI SDK of Vercel as a complete simplification of how to build that category of applications. And that's why you see that a lot of AI startups use Vercel, because just like we made it easy to deploy Next.js way back in the day, we now made it easy again to build and deploy AI native applications.
So let's get really tactical about AI SDK, and we'll also get into V0, but appreciate you laying out the two products. So with AI SDK, also I hear your point, because I actually do think that in very early LLM land, because a lot of researchers were interested in ML and LLM, there was a lot of Python, kind of like Python native support
Totally.
before it moved to more TypeScript, JavaScript. And so I certainly see that app developer like want and need for something better. So maybe let's talk about like the path to productionizing the first version of Vercel AI SDK. Did you build a specific AI team and say, go ship this thing, or what happens? How does that happen?
Yeah, so we were seeing the customer demand. We're seeing that there was a ton of excitement. People were really curious. So one of the things that we started doing was, can we have our DX engineers who basically create templates, make the developer experience better? Can we have them provide sort of examples of how to create these AI applications? So we launched a bunch of really successful examples. In fact, the killer app of the AI SDK is essentially what looks like a open source ChatGPT. And we give it out of the world with a very simple hypothesis. ChatGPT is great, but there's going to be an emergence of domain-specific versions of it. There's going to be internal versions of ChatGPT. There's going to be, ChatGPT for finance, which ended up happening. There's going to be ChatGPT for data science, which ended up happening. We built ChatGPT for web developers. So that was kind of the thesis, and it really worked out because those templates and those libraries that we're creating became really successful. And to your question, there was almost like a Next.js unveil experience here too, because a lot of the libraries that we were creating in those templates, we started noticing, wait, this is like we're just copying and pasting a lot of code. There's a common pattern here. We started seeing a lot of LLMs come out, and developers were asking for like, oh, can you give me that template, but with support for Gemini? Can you give me that template, but for support for Llama? And so we saw there was an opportunity for creating a very thin layer on top of the LLM that provided the conveniences for streaming and the model portability. And that's kind of how we formalized it into the AI SDK, which is basically our fastest growing open source project at the moment. It just surpassed all of the other libraries. And to your point about Vercel has this unique point of view in TypeScript, React, and JavaScript, whereas a lot of the ML and deep learning industry had this Python sort of, momentum. And that's also what we brought to the table. We're making AI accessible to application engineers, a lot of whom use JavaScript, TypeScript, React.
Yeah, I'm actually really curious about that because my background is more in data science, machine learning. So I come from, we'll call it like that other side of the table. And I'm really curious if you see from a persona perspective, are the same customers that it sounds like the origination of Vercel AI SDK was customers who are using Vercel who want to incorporate some AI capabilities. I'm curious if there are any new people who come into, of course, you're always going to be getting new customers and growing, but like new personas or new flavors of people who are interested in this type of development.
Yes, absolutely. So one thing that is really interesting about this world is even if you were a very backend centric company, like focused on data science or ML, the AI world is almost forcing your hand to create all these more advanced user interfaces. If you look at B0, if you look at Anthropic Artifacts, if you look at OpenAI Canvas, these are pretty sophisticated user experiences. And so what we started seeing was there are a lot of backend developers that want to dive in into this world. And so we started attracting a lot of those. And actually, this is a good segue for why V0. So even just today, I got this love letter from someone that was saying, I'm a backend developer. I've never written a single line of React. And because of V0, I was able to ship in days or hours what it would have taken me weeks or months. And so we are actually with V0, by giving you this chat interface to create UI, we're making it so much more accessible for everybody, really. People that don't know how to code, people that know backend, and people that want to sharpen their front end skills or learn the latest and greatest features.
I could go and use one of these models and ask them to help me code. How is V0 different than using an out-of-the-box model to help you with front-end code?
Yeah, one of the biggest pieces of feedback that we've gotten from developers was ChatGPT is good, but it doesn't know the specifics of my technology. It doesn't use the latest versions. It uses the wrong package. There's a better package for this. In many ways, what people were asking was, I love how Vercel has certain opinions about web development. They obviously create a lot of the tools that I use. Can you create an AI that almost like exports your brain to the world? And it's funny because that's almost like how the system and the data flywheel behind it works. Another interesting thing that V0 has done for Vercel is, and you know this being a venture capitalist, a lot of people in open source think that they can build a support, and this is kind of like a misconception, I think, a support-based or professional services-based business. It's super tempting. So you put out Next.js, and as it becomes successful, a lot of people are knocking on your door saying, well, you're the expert. Can you build an app for me? Or we're about to go live for the world's largest retailer and grocery store. Can you give me some support? Like, these are real conversations that I was having. And I was like, look, no, sorry, I can't give you support. I'm out here building specialized cloud infrastructure. I'm building the framework. I'm not going to spin up, like a whole arm of our company for low margin, not so interesting, not so technological revenue sources. But when you look at V0, V0 actually allows me to now say yes to those people because they get access to us in a much more scalable way. It's like they're getting access to the brain of the creators and to some extent and respectfully, like the taste makers, because we have certain opinions about web development, and AI has just been able to give us that, but at scale.
What did you have to do to incorporate sort of beyond the out-of-the-box models, incorporate that taste into V0 I used V0 last night. So how do you incorporate like the context as well as the taste, for lack of a better word?
Yeah, I think the biggest part that every company can provide in the AI age is their own data, and even more importantly, perhaps their own evaluations of the answers. So the thing that makes V0 special is that I was mentioning earlier, like, imagine if I could deploy my CTO, who was at Google for 13 years, and he could review the code of all of our customers and give them performance recommendations. How can I automate that process and make it scalable? Well,
the thing that very happy customers and a very unhappy CTO.
That's right. So what I can do is I can have him review the evaluations of our model. So if the model says, okay, in order to improve the responsiveness of this page, you have to rewrite it in Haskell, then our CTO is going to say, no, that's garbage. That's not how you make that web page faster. So imagine if we can do that, but at scale, meaning we build up large data sets, we build up our evaluations, and also we're constantly infusing it with what we call the frontier data, which is the data that the models don't have. Why don't they have it? Because models have checkpoints. And the world is changing very quickly in between those checkpoints. We're always learning new insights, new recommendations, new APIs, new libraries. So that's the flywheel that you want to get going on top of the model.
Where are you getting frontier? Well, fine if you don't want to share, but maybe what are some sources of frontier data? And also, who is actually building? I assume it's not all your CTO. Who is building the eval sets?
It's all of our data. It's in fact it's so funny because at Vercel we'd have all these conversations in between us where we'd be trying to understand how to improve something, and then someone says something amazing. And so like part of what we're trying to do is look, of course we have engineers that are dedicated to doing solutions engineering. We have a lot of people working on the framework. We have a lot of people working on V0 itself. We dedicate a lot of time to curate the data sets that we are learning from. And also, we're trying to, as a company, become more of this sort of like AI first company. So it actually just happened. We launched Terraform support for the Vercel firewall. And one of the things that we did is like we announced, okay, you can now apply firewall rules at the Vercel edge with Terraform. Awesome. But concurrently with that, we ensured that V0 was an expert in Terraform and the Vercel firewall rules, because this is going to be the expectation of our customer, right? And I think this is a good kind of illustration of how we're going from DX 1.0 to DX 2.0, because in the old world, the quality of my release would have been judged by like how fast the documentation is and how nice it looks and if it has examples and whatever. In a DX 2.0 world, I'm going to be judged by like, hey, V0, can you give me some code to block these IPs that I have in this CSV file inside a GitHub action so that when my deployment rolls out, all the blocks are applied? And V0 is going to be, yeah, I got it. Boom.
So one of the things that you mentioned is the power of adding your own data and context and like really high quality evals relative to the models. I imagine there's a subset of companies that are doing that themselves who are using Vercel. And I'm just curious, maybe it's even going backwards to pre-AI days, but there was a moment in time where kind of Jamstack was very in fashion. What does it look like to build a category in front end? And how are you seeing, we talked about these TypeScript app developers wanting to use AI. How are you seeing them interfacing with the rest of the team who maybe has more the expertise in the data engineering to build that context for models that they use? Or is this mostly for out of the box? So I know it's a pretty vague question, but I'd love to understand both parts. Like, how do you both create this category? And then how does it interface with the rest of the development organization, especially in AI land?
Yeah, it's funny you asked this because just this morning I was telling our VP of AI, Jared Palmer, I think what's made V0 special for us is not really a specific feature or the model or the UI, or it's actually the product development process that we've established, which I think is actually radically different from how we're approaching product development in other areas. For instance, we try to be extremely iterative with the product to the point where we release changes every single day. Because of the nature of getting feedback so fast, I think that's also changing relative to older style product development. I'll give you an example. When I first launched Vercel, the dashboard, I put a lot of effort, and this was inspired by Stripe. I put a lot of effort in the feedback button. So you would have the classic display of like, your profile picture on the top right, and then there'll be help button, and then there'll be this feedback button that if you clicked it, it's very beautiful in line so that you don't lose any content super fast. It expands into a little form, and you can select an emoji. And that actually became super viral. In fact, when I recommend to newer entrepreneurs how to do marketing for their products, sometimes you can do marketing of your products by just explaining the details that are going into building your product. So that's what I did kind of intuitively way back in the day. It's like, y'all, look at this thing that we've created because we care about feedback so much. And a lot of people liked it a lot.
This is also the ethos of your README. Like, I think you just care a lot about someone can actually use this and understand what I was thinking and see examples, which is great.
Correct. And because it's all about kind of like showing how the sausage is made at Vercel, right? Because we're giving it the tools too. So we're super incentivized to share all of those details. And so, but if you step out, here's what we're doing. We're hoping that people give us feedback. We're reducing the friction of it. and we're adding emojis to make it more fun. So that actually gave us, for quote unquote the old world, and we still have it, of course, it gave us some really good results. The feedback would flow in real time into Slack, and we would try to act on it as soon as possible. Now, when you have an AI native product, you don't really have a feedback button in the top right. You might, but you're actually getting feedback every single time. Every single interaction with the product is a feedback opportunity. So we probably have, I mean, this is a back of the envelope calculation, but we probably have 2 orders of magnitude more feedback on the product than we had on the older one that was more opportunistic. If I feel good today, I'm going to give you feedback. And what's more, we don't even ask you for frowning face, crying, whatever, because we analyze the sentiment with AI. So we have this feedback loop that is also AI native itself. We do cluster classification of feedback. We put it into a machine.
Let's be very explicit. What is the feedback that you are measuring?
So a key ingredient, and this is something that I loved about the early Copilot in VS Code, a key ingredient of AI is that AI that is suggestive will have some kind of acceptance rate. So if you're suggesting ghost text in VS Code, you might accept it or decline it. And so for us in V0, we have all these signals that the generation was good for the customer or bad for the customer. The other thing we have is that instead of having this global button in the top right for feedback, we have all these inline opportunities. And so we say, oh, thumbs up, thumbs down, delete. There's all these opportunities for like having the input of the customer flow to our team and make the product better. And because we're making the product better, I mean, because we're getting all this feedback, that's what's created this more iterative, day by day sort of like product iteration process. And that's what I think is fundamentally different from how we're building older styles of products.
Was the team like, this is super important, so we need to make sure that we're measuring it? Or did it come second nature when you saw that it started to take off?
It's a couple of things. For example, performance is so important, which is why we invest so much in the Vercel infrastructure performance, that you see very clearly that the adoption of the product is very correlated with the performance of the entire rendering pipeline that we're giving the customer. So if the product slows down, like the engagement slows down. And so we're very sensitive to all of these signals because we started seeing that like, oh, look, if we have a regression in some kind of type of answer, then engagement plummets. So I think it was very natural that if you're not doing it, you're probably not getting the product outcomes that you want. But it's also very intrinsic to the product that you're building. So it does come second nature to some extent. You know that you're operating in a world of some amount of uncertainty, right? Like we all know that the world has come a very long way from the times where like everybody was pointing out hallucinations in LLMs. People don't even talk about it as much, but there's still a fair amount of, let's call it like gray space where the answer is not black or white and like there's room for improvement. So I think it comes naturally with a kind of a stochastic system that people are dealing with.
Well, let's actually separate two things. And I think you covered some of this, but there's actually the better tools and platform for front-end engineers to build AI applications. And then there's these better models, which maybe we could say that there's a line where context feeds into the better models, but let's just say better models out of the box who can do more and maybe have more training data. So I'm curious how you think about that divide. And maybe I'd ask, what do you think, when you think about the future of V0 and the future of AI SDK, what do you think can be abstracted away and improved on at the Vercel level or any tooling versus what do you think will be taken care of over time with better models that maybe you need to hack around today?
I think there's opportunities all over the stack, right? So when you're building, going back to like the 1.0 versus 2.0 metaphor, I think a lot of the tools that served us well in the 1.0 world, they might still work. A lot of them are probably getting retrofitted. And then there's an opportunity to think, okay, what is the AI native version of that tool or that workflow? I think it'll impact everything. So One example would be when I think about customer support, right? Obviously, everybody's talking about how AI can help with customer support and whatnot. But I think people are thinking about the kind of like the easy version of that, which is I throw in an AI widget into my support flow, and then the AI answers some questions, and then humans answer some. I think about that a little bit more dramatically. I think we have to rethink the support function almost as an AI native success engineering function, where the role of support is to supervise the AI and create those feedback loops with the AI rather than being the sort of, if you pass the AI filter, it gets to the human. I think, which is awesome because the AI should be the ticket processing machine that burns down from a list, right? And the human is the one that's actually bringing the insight, intelligence, supervision, editorial on top of that process. So that's just one example where I see that every function within a company is changing to become sort of this AI native function. And then that's also applying to tools, right? One great example is the evaluation is almost like the new pull request. Pull requests were very important because you were building pure software, and all you're doing is the data is almost like somewhat constant. Like you're reviewing a piece of code that has inputs and outputs, and you're doing the algorithmic check, right? In a world of 2.0 where like the data is so important, of course you're going to have pull requests, but now you have this like new sort of like PR, is the PR of the evolution of the context and data infused into models. And so that's another example where we're seeing an emergence of categories of tools that address that thing. And because that thing is becoming increasingly important, there's a case to be made that it'll overshadow in its importance the classic PR.
That's an interesting analogy. I thought you were going to go in a different direction there and use the unit test example, which is maybe the more you have a set of evals that you care about. And if you make an update to the data, to the model, you want to understand if you make a change that it's not going to have a regression on some set of evals too. So the analogies are interesting. I'm curious, you had mentioned customer support with humans, not AI supervising humans, humans supervising AI. I'm really curious about the future of like software too. And so something I spend a lot of time thinking about is, people talk about agents that can do tasks on websites. We're not there yet, but you've spent a lot of time thinking about front end and how websites are presented to humans and generative UI. What does experience look like for different humans? So I'm curious, if you foresee a future where websites are designed in a different way for AI interaction. Like, does this have an implication for front end developers? Does AI learn to act like human? Where do you think the world goes there?
Yeah, I've been a big believer that the most successful AI products have been the ones that interface with the world as it is, as opposed to the world that doesn't exist. And the best example is Waymo, that us luckily in San Francisco have the pleasure of getting access to, where Waymo has worked so well for me because it didn't require that the roads and street lights and other cars change in any way. It just adapted to that world. And I think something similar is going to happen with agents, where if we need to create a bunch of new websites for agents, we're probably going to see dramatically less adoption than the agent that actually just figures out the same interface that a human would. The other reason from first principles that I believe that should be the case is that what we're doing when we optimize a UI is we are cutting down the time. It's all about faster, ultimately, right? Like a lot of the things that Vercel's infrastructure helps with is retailers or DTC brands or anybody that advertises on, for example, Instagram. And I click on the ad and it opens up a whatever. It could be a quiz, it could be a product to buy. What is the goal of the retailer at that point? Well, they need to perform some transaction and they need to do it as fast as possible. And so we help with that part, the as fast as possible. So if you have a website that is streamlined, that is fast, and it's error free, then an agent will be able to complete that task perfectly. I actually think that we're going to have agent feedback being given back to developers. So one of the things that we're doing with the Vercel firewall is we're helping customers understand their AI bot activity. For example, we have a one-click template that allows you to block all the user agents of AI bots because maybe your data is so important that you don't want it to flow to, or by the way, it's not just data, it's also the compute cost associated. News just came out that the ByteDance crawl bot is now several times more active than the next biggest bot. Like they're crawling the internet at a magnificent rate. And so that costs you in terms of compute costs and business opportunity. So we made it one click to block ByteCrawler or whatever it's called. Or maybe you love it and you're like, yeah, my content, I needed to totally influence the intelligence of ByteDance and TikTok. And so please go ahead. So visibility into bot and agent activity is going to be absolutely crucial. We're partnering with Auth0 and Okta to give developers patterns for how to authenticate users and users grant authorization to agents and understand whether the activity on the website is agentic or it's human or it's an authorized agent on behalf of a human. Because I think we're also going to have the scenario where agents will have to find hacks and pretend they're human, or they're going to be like legitimately authorized by a human to act on their behalf. So there's going to be a whole rainbow of options here.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And not just to block agent activity, right? But to analyze, how does this work for agent activity versus human activity? And we, over time, the Waymo example, like optimized for both as the skill.
That's right. And that's why I do believe that your initial hypothesis is correct in that when you start getting that feedback, you might decide to invest in a pathway that is better for the agent. What I don't think, but I see it more as an optimization than a requirement. And I think it also falls under the same sort of like dynamic rendering and personalization sort of investment paradigm that we've been pushing to the industry, which is make your site not static. You call that Jamstack. If the site is static, it's going to be very hard to say if AI bot serve this, else serve this. Or even there's also all these gradients. For example, rate limiting is very important. Maybe you do want a little bit of agentic activity for a certain part, but then the agent has to pay you in order to consume more of that data. So you need to start imposing rate limits to access to the data. And as you could imagine, there's going to be a lot of infrastructure that is required to make these patterns increasingly easier to deploy, like keeping track of the activity and rate limiting and so on and so forth. And it's going to be exciting to see how this sort of new DX for managing agents continues to evolve.
Guillermo, it's fascinating. I love hearing about where you think the future of developer experience is going, and we'll love to see how these products evolve over time too, as models evolve and the world evolves. We're out of time, so just one last question. How has building Vercel changed you as a leader and as a person?
As a leader, I think it's completely transformed me, because in the early days, Vercel was just about me writing code and pushing things and whatever, and like trying to survive the day by day. And now my job is to build the best possible team and uplift them. And whenever I can, coach them and enable all the feedback mechanisms that make people do the best work of their lives at Vercel if we can. And on the personal life, I've always been a big believer in like work and life integration. So I don't think it's changed me that much. I nerd out as much as possible on the tech. And I try to now, my kids are hopefully, knock on wood, nerds too. So I integrate them into what I do, and I teach them, and I bring them to conferences. I bring them to AI hackathons. So yeah, I love this lifestyle, so hopefully they'll love it too.
I love it. So, to the future of developer experience and raising nerds, thank you so much for coming on.
Yes, thank you.